Fired on my first day. That's what the brand new chief people officer, the founder's niece, told me without even lifting her eyes from the champagne gold tablet she'd been flashing around since she strutted into the building. Rhea Calder, we're ending your employment effective immediately, she said, voice sweet as frosting and just as artificial. Security will escort you out. It was my first hour at Horizon Nautics, a supposedly family-run innovation hub that, judging by the jittery intern hovering behind her, was really just a dynasty of fragile heirs treating the company like a board game they inherited, not a business they built. No handshake, no explanation, not even a single question about why I'd been recruited in the first place. She just nudged the printed termination memo across the table with one manicured finger, like she was validating a parking ticket. I didn't argue. I didn't plead. I didn't even blink. 30 years in corporate warfare teach you exactly when to talk and when to let someone hang themselves with their own paperwork. I stood, smoothed my jacket, and set my Horizon visitor badge on her desk like a chip I was done pretending to play with. She looked triumphant, convinced she'd just slayed a dragon. Poor child. She had no idea she'd swung at the wrong one. I want this done properly, I said quietly. So please let your uncle know the board meeting in 3 hours is going to be historic. For the first time, her smile cracked. I walked out past the HR junior who looked like he'd just watched a live grenade roll across the carpet, past the security guard holding an escort order he'd never get to use, past the wall-sized portrait of the Arden family. All pearl smiles, all legacy, all blinding ego. Funny thing, not one frame showed the woman who drafted their first governance charter. Me. Call this not punishment, just careful prelude. And since you're already here watching the first spark hit dry timber, tap subscribe, hit like, do whatever keeps you in the loop, not because I need it, but because you're about to see exactly what happens when the woman you try to fire is the one who secretly owns the building. Exactly 3 hours. That's how long Horizon Nautics had before the entire ground shifted under their marble floors. I imagine that while I walked calmly out of the lobby, the founder's niece, newly crowned chief people officer, was upstairs celebrating her first big leadership move. She probably poured herself a sparkling water, pinned the termination memo to her wall like a trophy, maybe even drafted a LinkedIn post about day one courage. Meanwhile, the legal grenade she'd just pulled the pin on was already midair. Because before she fired me, I'd sent a courier real paper, certified, time-stamped, to every board member, every institutional investor, every outside counsel tied to Horizon Nautics. Inside each envelope was a single page almost no one in that building remembered existed. Clause 28B, Emergency Shareholder Reversion. A clause I personally drafted 16 years ago when Horizon Nautics was nothing but a rented dockside warehouse and a half-broken prototype that barely stayed afloat. Back then, Conrad Arden, the founder, didn't understand half the corporate documents he signed. He cared about ideas, not infrastructure, and he never questioned why I insisted on handling governance myself. Clause 28B spelled out one thing with brutal clarity. If any non-equity appointee terminated a corporate officer without a formal board vote, all executive authority would be frozen on impact, and control would revert to the majority shareholder. And I am that majority shareholder. 73%. Held quietly through layered Delaware entities, tucked behind holding companies no one bothers to look up once the money starts rolling in. The family thought I'd cashed out years ago. They were wrong. I just stopped correcting them. The founder's niece didn't know that. She didn't know anything that mattered. While she was upstairs measuring her new era in plants and throw pillows, the board was opening a packet labeled Immediate Suspension of Executive Authority, Clause 28B, triggered. Somewhere across the city, a director canceled lunch. Another walked out of a conference. One nearly spit out his espresso when he saw the equity chart. My name, Rhea Calder, sitting on a thick majority slice of the pie. Conrad hadn't seen the packet yet, but he would. And he would not be smiling. Because while his niece believed she'd removed me from the company, what she'd actually done was remove herself from the list of people whose opinions legally mattered. What happens next in these situations is predictable, almost procedural. First comes confusion, then denial, then the dawning horror when everyone realizes the person they tried to erase is the one who poured the concrete under their feet. She hadn't just crossed a line. She'd triggered the corporate equivalent of a fault line, one I'd built into the bedrock on purpose. And in 3 hours, when that boardroom door closed and the cameras started recording, she was going to learn the first rule of real corporate empires. Never try to fire the woman who wrote the rules of the kingdom, especially when she still owns the crown. By the time the founder's niece finally noticed something was wrong, the damage was already beyond reversal. It started small, too small for someone like her to recognize. A dashboard metric flickered, then froze. A permissions icon dimmed from bright blue to gray. A single red warning line appeared at the top of her internal equity portal. Unauthorized request. Please contact shareholder admin. She frowned at it like it was a glitch, not a warning. She refreshed the page. Same error. She tried again, as if pounding the keyboard would make the system respect her job title. Downstairs, in the compliance wing most executives never visit, the senior governance attorney had already laid my activation packet across a long conference table. The thing looked heavy even before anyone touched it. Hard copies, notarized signatures, timestamps, cross-references, equity ledgers, all the paper trails everyone assumed had quietly disappeared. One junior attorney whispered, "How did nobody catch this?" The head of compliance didn't look up as she answered, "Because she designed it so you wouldn't." Across town, Conrad Arden was still on the golf course when his phone buzzed with the first urgent call from headquarters. He let it ring out, then a second. Finally, his personal attorney called from a number Conrad never ignored. "Conrad, you need to come back. Now." He didn't finish the hole. He didn't tip the caddy. 26 minutes later, he walked into Horizon Nautics' executive floor, tracking bits of grass across polished tile. Half the board was already there, ties loosened, jackets off, faces tight with the strain of realizing they'd missed something big. The CFO held my packet like it might explode if he breathed too hard near it. Conrad didn't sit. "What is this about?" he demanded. The general counsel inhaled, opened to the first page, and read aloud. Per Clause 28B of the Horizon Shareholder Agreement, any termination executed by a non-equity appointee without prior board vote triggers immediate reversion of executive authority to the majority shareholder. Conrad blinked once, twice. His voice dropped. "Who triggered it?" Silence stretched. Finally, the compliance director slid the activation letter across the table. My signature sat at the bottom, time-stamped 7:04 a.m., almost an hour before his niece tried to fire me. Conrad's jaw tightened. "She doesn't have the authority to do that," he said. "She never did," the counsel replied. "She holds no equity. Her action was invalid on contact. Legally, she activated the full suspension of her own powers." The color drained from Conrad's face. Upstairs, refreshing her frozen screens like a gambler chasing a lost bet, the founder's niece still thought the system was broken. Everyone in that conference room understood. The system was working exactly as I built it, and I was already on my way back. The founder's niece didn't understand what was happening, not at first. Entitlement makes people slow. She tried to reopen the equity dashboard. Error. She tried the executive analytics panel. Access denied. She attempted to approve her own expense request, something she'd done often in the last 24 hours, just to remind people she could. This time the button stayed gray. Her fingers hovered over the keyboard, like the system owed her an apology for ignoring her title. Across the building, in an office that still smelled of old servers and burnt coffee, the IT director stared at the termination request she'd sent that morning. Marcus Hale had been at Horizon long before the Arden family started treating the company like a prop in their brand story. When the request hit his inbox, he'd paused. Something about it felt wrong. Now, with the back-end registry open, everything snapped into focus. There I was. Primary Administrator. Active Compliance Token. Active Shareholder Registry. Controller. Active Equity Control Access. 73.02%. The numbers glowed on his monitor like hazard lights. Marcus didn't freeze my account. He didn't revoke my admin rights. He didn't even respond to her email. Instead, he quietly closed the message, unplugged his laptop, and walked it down the hall to legal like he was carrying a live explosive. She still has full root, he told the head of compliance. If I deactivate her, we lose 3 compliance systems, 5 investor portals, the auto-filing link to regulators, and the shareholder ledger. Legal didn't even look up from my packet. Don't touch a thing. Upstairs, oblivious to her own collapse, the niece refreshed her dashboard again, this time with more force, like hitting F5 harder might bend reality. When the screen refused to change, she felt it for the first time, that thin, cold line down the spine that shows up when power starts leaking through fingers that were never strong enough to hold it. The room suddenly felt smaller around her. Then her phone buzzed. Unknown number. What happened? I thought she was untouchable. She frowned. Who? She opened the contact info and felt her stomach drop. It was from Horizon's lead investor, a man who almost never contacted executives directly and absolutely never texted her. She reread the message twice. The word she landed like a punch. The untouchable woman wasn't her. It was me. Her mind scrambled for a narrative that made sense. None did. Panic pushed her out of her chair. She strode down the executive hallway, heels hitting stone too loud, her own anxiety echoing back at her. When she reached Conrad's office, the door was closed, locked. Through the frosted glass, she could see silhouettes, legal, finance, governance, clustered around the founder like surgeons around a failing patient. She knocked. No answer. She knocked again, harder. They heard her. No one moved. Inside, the CFO stared at my equity breakdown spread across the table. My God, Conrad muttered, voice thin. What has she done? The general counsel didn't have to ask who he meant. Not Rhea, he said quietly. Your niece. Tessa Arden didn't walk back to her office. She fled. Her steps were sharp, uneven, the frantic rhythm of someone trying to outrun a truth that was already sitting calmly at her desk, waiting. She slammed her door shut, dropped into her chair, and yanked her laptop open like the machine owed her an explanation. The first thing she pulled up wasn't a report or a dashboard. It was her half-finished LinkedIn post. Today, I made my first difficult decision as Chief People Officer at Horizon Nautics. The bragging, the self-praise, the hashtags about courage and leadership. For a long second, she just stared at it, the digital monument to an ego that hadn't even had time to cool. Then she dragged her cursor across the entire paragraph and hit backspace. The screen went blank. For the first time in her carefully padded career, she had absolutely no idea what to write. She clicked over to her inbox. Silence. Normally, her email was a waterfall of pings, approvals, CCs, invitations, pointless internal newsletters. Now, nothing. No board updates, no legal follow-ups, no frantic messages asking for her input. It was as if, in the span of an hour, the entire company had silently agreed she didn't exist anymore. She opened the internal directory. Her title was still there, Chief People Officer, but it was grayed out. She clicked her name. Her profile photo failed to load. No error message, just an empty frame where her face used to be. The system was already treating her like a ghost, still listed, but stripped of weight, stripped of authority. A knock at the door made her jump. A nervous intern poked his head in, eyes darting anywhere but her face. Ms. Arden, the boardroom asked me to deliver this." He stepped in, placed a thick, cream-colored envelope on her desk, heavy stock, embossed edges, the kind of paper no one wasted on good news. She snatched it the second he left and tore it open with shaking hands. Inside was a single printed page. Urgent notice. Executive suspension, Clause 28B. All authority granted to you as Chief People Officer is revoked, effective immediately. You are requested to appear as an observer only. Voting privileges, none. Operational control, none. Approval access, none. Her vision blurred, but she forced herself to read the signatures at the bottom. Board members, investor representatives, general counsel, governance oversight. And then the final line. Majority shareholder, Rhea Calder, 73.2%. Her throat closed. She reread the name again and again, like it might change if she stared hard enough. It didn't. How does she own that much? She whispered to no one. Her monitor flickered. Once, twice. Then every open window minimized itself, replaced by a single system notification in the center of her screen. Attention. Your termination action has been logged as unauthorized. Board review in progress. Do not attempt further changes. Tessa stumbled back from the desk like the laptop had burned her. She hadn't simply failed to fire someone. She hadn't just lost a job title. She was being quietly, surgically erased, stripped of levers she never truly owned. And for the first time since she breezed into Horizon Nautics that morning, she understood what real power looked like. It didn't shout. It didn't brag. It just sat in the structure and waited for days like this. The boardroom was already full when Tessa arrived. Full not in the way of casual meetings and status updates, but in that tight, sharpened way buildings get when everyone suddenly remembers who can sign their paychecks. No side chatter, no nervous laughter, just quiet tension and the soft scrape of chairs against polished wood. She paused in the doorway, clutching her leather portfolio like a life raft. "Good afternoon," she began, voice thinner than she meant it to be. "I'm here to—" The board chair lifted a hand, stopping her mid-sentence. "You may observe," he said calmly, "but that seat is not yours." Her eyes flicked to the chair at the head of the table, the one she'd mentally measured for herself this morning. "Reserved," the chair added. "For who?" she whispered. No one answered her. At the far end of the table, the general counsel flipped shut a thick stack of documents with the finality of a judge closing a case file. Per Clause 28B, he said, your appointment as Chief People Officer has been suspended, effective immediately. Tessa blinked too fast. I don't understand. That clause was hypothetical, a safeguard. No clause in a shareholder agreement is hypothetical, he replied. Yours was activated this morning with proper documentation. But who even filed it? She asked, her voice cracking on the last word. Silence collected in the room like dust. Finally, the board chair leaned back and said, she did. He didn't have to say the name. Everyone knew who he meant. Rhea Calder. The woman Tessa thought she'd fired before finishing her first cup of coffee. The woman the company had just rediscovered as its true center of gravity. Someone at the table shifted, creating a subtle space around Tessa, as if corporate gravity itself had decided she no longer belonged in orbit. Conrad sat near the middle of the table, eyes fixed on the polished surface, jaw tight. He didn't look at her. Couldn't. His silence hurt more than any outburst. But she doesn't even work here anymore, Tessa insisted weakly. She's not an employee. The general counsel's tone softened by a fraction. She was never just an employee, he said. She is the company. You tried to terminate a majority shareholder. The words landed like a sentence. Before Tessa could respond, the door opened. An executive assistant slipped in quietly, carrying a small, gold-trimmed nameplate. She walked to the head of the table and set it down with delicate precision. Rhea Calder, majority shareholder. Tessa's breath caught. Her pulse roared in her ears. And then, at exactly 3 p.m., the door handle turned again, slow, deliberate, final. Every head in the room lifted. Tessa turned and the color drained from her face. Rhea stepped into the boardroom like she'd never left it. Not rushing, not smiling, not demanding attention. She didn't need to. The room adjusted around her. Rhea didn't rush. She closed the door behind her with a soft click that sounded, in that room, like the end of a chapter. Power doesn't need volume. It just needs a place to sit. She walked the length of the table, heels tapping once, twice, 3 times against the polished floor, each step steady enough to make people straighten in their chairs without realizing why. She didn't look at Tessa. She didn't have to. The niece was already half standing, half collapsing, clutching her empty portfolio like a shield made of cardboard. Rhea stopped at the head of the table, in front of the gold-trimmed nameplate bearing her name. She didn't sit. Not yet. She laid a slim black folder in front of her and rested both hands on the back of the chair. As majority shareholder, she said, voice clear but not raised, I am requesting a binding vote to rescind all executive appointments made within the last 48 hours. The sentence dropped into the room like an iron bar. No one argued. No one stalled. The board chair nodded once, as if he'd been waiting for that exact line. Motion received and entered into record, he said. We will proceed to discussion and vote. Tessa found her voice, thin and frayed. This can't be real, she whispered. I didn't know. No one told me you. Her eyes locked on Rhea. You could have warned me. Rhea finally looked at her then, gaze steady, almost tired. I did, she said. 30 years of governance frameworks, hundreds of pages of bylaws, every investor briefing, every compliance update. All of it was the warning. Tessa shook her head, panic crowding out reason. You set this up. You planned this. You wanted me to fail. No, Rhea replied calmly. I planned the company. I planned its safety, its structure, its future. You planned a power trip. Our plans collided. The board chair cleared his throat, slicing through the tension. The vote will proceed, he said. The board will adjourn briefly for closed session. Ms. Calder, you may remain. That wasn't a courtesy. It was a recognition. Rhea inclined her head. I will. As the directors began to rise, Tessa lurched a step closer to Rhea, desperation overriding decorum. You can't take everything, she whispered, eyes glassy. You can't just erase me! Rhea leaned in just enough that only Tessa could hear her. Tessa, she said quietly, I'm not taking anything. I already own it. Tessa's grip tightened on the back of a chair. Her world shrank to one undeniable fact. She had tried to fire the woman who had designed the very floor she was standing on. The board members filed out into the adjoining conference room, legal and investor reps moving with the slow, deliberate rhythm of people who know the outcome before the vote is even called. The door closed behind them with a soft thud. For a moment, the main boardroom held only two people. The niece who had mistaken her last name for a business model, and the architect who had built the model in the first place. The silence between them was louder than any argument. Tessa finally sank into a chair, shoulders shaking, portfolio slipping from her grip. You don't understand, she muttered. I just wanted to prove I could lead. Rhea studied her for a beat. Leadership isn't firing the most experienced person in the room to make yourself feel taller, she said. It's understanding the foundation before you start kicking at the walls. The side door opened. The board filed back in, faces set, laptops in hand. Everyone took their seats. This time, Rhea sat too slowly, deliberately taking the head chair like it had been waiting for her all along. The board chair folded his hands. The vote has been taken, he said. The results are unanimous. And just like that, the empire Tessa thought she was inheriting slipped completely, legally, and permanently out of her hands. The board has concluded its review, the chair announced. Under Clause 28B, all executive appointments made within the last 48 hours are hereby rescinded. The words didn't echo. They just landed. Heavy. Final. Impossible to negotiate with. Across the table, Tessa sucked in a breath like someone had punched her in the ribs. Rescinded? She repeated. Wait, that includes... Yes, the chair said, not unkindly. That includes your appointment. Her mouth opened, then shut. For the first time all day, she seemed to understand that this wasn't a conversation. It was a record being written. Furthermore, the chair continued, pending shareholder oversight, Ms. Arden is suspended from all strategic, operational, and financial functions, effective immediately. Tessa's head snapped up. Suspended? I'm family. The CFO didn't even bother looking at her. Family doesn't outrank equity. Her gaze darted to Conrad, searching for backup. You told me I could make real decisions, she said, voice rising. Conrad finally looked at her. His expression wasn't angry. It was exhausted. I told you to observe, he said quietly. You decided to rule. The distinction gutted her more than any shouted accusation. She turned back to Rhea, desperation turning sharp. You're really going to let them do this? Over one mistake? Rhea's tone stayed level. You didn't threaten me, she said. You threatened the company. There's a difference. The general counsel cleared his throat. The board also recommends immediate removal of Ms. Arden's system access, physical credentials, and internal approvals, he said. She may remain present today as an observer only, not a participant. That last word hit harder than suspended. Not a participant. In her own mind, this room had been her stage. Now she was being told she could only watch from the cheap seats. Rhea opened her black folder, the movement small but commanding. Next item, she said. We will initiate a full audit of all leadership decisions made in the last 7 days. Any action taken without proper authority or documentation will be reversed or flagged for remediation. Around the table, laptops opened, pens clicked. Board members straightened, sliding back into the familiar rhythm of actual work. Everyone moved forward. Everyone except Tessa. She sat, frozen, staring at an org chart on the wall she now understood would never again include her name near the top. This wasn't a dramatic firing scene. There would be no shouting, no security dragging her out by the elbow, just a quiet, methodical shrinking of her world until there was no corner of the company left that still answered to her. The board chair closed his notebook. For the record, he said, Horizon Nautics acknowledges Ms. Calder as executive chair and majority shareholder, with full authority over governance and restructuring. Rhea nodded once, not triumphant, just settled. The empire hadn't fallen. It had simply remembered who actually owned it. When the meeting finally dissolved into motion chairs sliding back, laptops closing, directors murmuring to their assistants, Tessa stayed in her seat, hollow and still. The room moved on without her. Conrad waited until the last board member stepped out, then looked across the table at Rhea. A word? He asked. She nodded once. They stepped into the adjoining strategy room, built for conversations no one wanted recorded. Conrad closed the door and remained there a moment, shoulders slumped under the weight of a history he'd spent years ignoring. For the first time since that rented dockside warehouse, he looked old. I never meant for it to go this far, he said, rubbing his temples. She's young. She doesn't understand the structure you built. You mean the structure you approved, Rhea replied. 23 different times. He winced. When you hired me, she continued, Horizon was 2 laptops, a leaky roof, and an accountant who couldn't track petty cash. I gave you stability. You gave me room to build. And I trusted you, he murmured. You trusted me, she said, until your family wanted titles. He didn't argue. Finally, he exhaled. What happens next? Rhea opened her folder and slid 2 sheets of paper across the table. Clean, concise, printed on the same stock they used for shareholder resolutions. This, she said, is what happens next. He picked up the first page, scanned it, and stopped midway. It was a leadership reorganization plan. Independent appointments, clear reporting lines, hard walls between governance and bloodlines. No ceremonial roles, no vague vice president titles for relatives. A 5-year structure that put competence ahead of last names. He set it down and picked up the second page. A buyout option. She would sell her 73% at a valuation that would hurt but not kill him. No lawsuits, no leaks, no scorched earth headlines. A clean break, if he wanted it. He could keep the name, the building, the story. She would walk away. You're giving me a choice, he said. I'm giving the company a choice, she corrected. You're just holding the pen. His gaze drifted back to the reorganization plan. And Tessa? He asked. What happens to her? That depends on you, Rhea said, "but she will never hold authority here again." He closed his eyes, not in anger, in acceptance. When he opened them, something in his face had settled. He folded the buyout page and set it aside. His hand came to rest on the reorganization plan. "I built the name, Rhea," he said, "but you built the company. I won't fight the person who kept us alive." When he offered his hand this time, it wasn't as founder to employee. It was as a man finally recognizing who had really been carrying the weight. The next morning, Horizon Nautics felt different. Not louder, not busier, just cleaner. As if the building itself had finally remembered who designed its load-bearing walls. There were no dramatic announcements, no victory speeches, just one quiet calendar update that hit every director and senior manager at 8:58 a.m. Executive transition debrief, mandatory, 9:15 a.m., boardroom A. At 9:03, the elevator doors slid open on the executive floor. Tessa stepped out. No towering heels today, no stiff status armor blazer. Just a pale face and a woman who'd spent the night realizing that family didn't translate to immune. She walked to the security gate, swiped her badge like she always had. Red light. Access denied. For a second, she froze, staring at the reader like maybe it would apologize and turn green out of habit. It didn't. Clarence, the security supervisor who'd watched executives come and go for 2 decades, approached with quiet professionalism. "Miss Arden," he said gently, "I'm going to need your badge, your company phone, and your office keys." There was no anger in his tone. That made it worse. For the first time since she'd arrived at Horizon, Tessa didn't argue. She placed the badge, the phone, the slim ring of keys into his open hand. On the wall-mounted display above the turnstiles, the leadership board refreshed. Rhea Calder, Executive Chair and Majority Shareholder. No tagline, no glossy portrait. Just a name and a role that didn't need embellishment. Tessa watched it for a heartbeat too long, then turned and walked toward the exit. The glass doors closed behind her with a soft hiss, like the end of a very short chapter in a very long book. Inside Boardroom A, the people who actually kept the company alive were gathering. Operations, compliance, IT, finance, product. Not the ornamental titles, not the placeholders, the builders. Rhea entered last. She didn't make an entrance out of it. She just walked to the head of the table and sat down in the chair that now officially, legally, structurally belonged to her. "First order of business," she said. "We complete a full audit of the last 2 weeks. Any decision made without proper authority gets reversed, flagged, or rebuilt." Chairs straightened. Laptops opened. A different rhythm took hold. The rhythm of people who understood that power wasn't a performance. It was a responsibility. Marcus from IT stepped in near the end of the meeting. "Admin rights restored," he reported. "Root directory locked under your governance. No back doors." Rhea nodded. "Good. Let's make sure it stays that way." By noon, the org chart on the internal portal looked like a different company. Fewer vanity titles, clearer lines, stronger spine. By late afternoon, the place didn't feel like an heirloom anymore. It felt like an enterprise. As Rhea crossed the lobby to leave, the receptionist called out, "Miss Calder, would you like a new badge issued?" Rhea paused, then smiled, small, real. "Yes," she said. "Give me one with a gold chip this time." Outside, the air tasted lighter. Not because she'd come back, but because the illusion that she'd ever really left was finally gone. They hadn't fired her. They'd just reminded everyone who wrote the blueprint. And if you're still here, listening, ask yourself, who really holds the structure where you work? The ones with the loudest titles, or the ones who quietly built the rules? Tell me where you're watching from. Drop your stories in the comments. If you believe in justice, resilience, and taking back what you built, hit like, share this, and subscribe. The next story is already loading.